So, one of the most common questions that I will get from podcasters relates to podcast networks. And specifically, is there a benefit to joining one? And if so, what is that benefit? And also, correspondingly, what are any potential downsides to joining a network? And so, I think a lot of creators view joining a network as like hitting the big leagues, and it's just like all positives, and there's no reason you wouldn't want to join a network. And the reality is, I think that there are benefits to joining a network, joining the right network. And there are also a lot of downsides. And I know plenty of people who have joined networks who have then left the networks to go back solo. And sometimes that has been the network has helped them get up to the next level of legitimacy, but then it becomes kind of constricting. And so they no longer actually would benefit from being on a network. And sometimes it's just that the network offered them no benefits and actually hurt them in a lot of cases, and that they were better off staying solo the whole time. So the thought process for me behind whether or not to join a network and the pros and cons of it, essentially, there are two kind of pieces of value that a network will bring to the table. And so the first is the ability to grow the show through cross promotions with other shows on the network. That's one of the big reasons that podcasters want to join a network, is that the growth side of things. And this can certainly be true, but again, it depends a lot on the dynamics of the network. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is, if you are a small show, essentially the network's business model is like they need to, if they've got one or two shows that are really driving the network, that have a ton of impressions, a ton of downloads, like they need to milk those shows for all of their worth. And so there is some incentive for them to try and grow the smaller shows, but essentially a lot of the focus goes to the big shows, because those are the shows that are keeping the network afloat. And a lot of times the network's margins are very narrow, so they don't have a lot of bandwidth to be able to run experiments and use precious ad space on the big shows to test out, promoting small shows. And so what happens again and again and again and again and again, almost every small show that I've ever heard join a network, they basically say, well, they kind of oversold what they delivered to me. And so what a lot of small shows find is that they join a network, they get almost no cross promotion. They don't get a ton of support from the network. They maybe get a few kind of scraps thrown their way here and there, but ultimately they don't get much in terms of growth opportunities. And the ones that they do, they have to really hound the network for and really fight for those. And so you still have to kind of be your own advocate there. They're just not going to, most networks that I've heard do not just like invite you in and immediately start, promoting your show on all these big shows. It does happen from time to time, but a lot of times you have to really be your own advocate in getting those. And it still can be really hard to get the network to, if you're a smaller show on their roster, to give you those opportunities. So that's something that, there is a potential pro to that. But the funny thing is, it's typically like the shows that really benefit from networks almost don't need the networks. Like they're already so big, like that's why they get all the support from the network, is because they're bringing a lot into the network in terms of revenue from ad sales. And so the network, it behooves them to keep feeding that machine, even though this show is already doing really well. And so that's one of the frustrating realities in terms of growth. Now, the other benefit that people will sign up for a network for is for ad sales. And so some shows, some hosts, they don't really care about the growth side of things. They just want somebody to handle the ad sales. And so again, this is usually when that becomes a benefit, it's because the podcaster is already doing all their own ad sales and they're probably doing pretty well. And so ad sales has become essentially a full-time job for them, which would imply that they have a decent sized show. They have a lot of sponsors to reach out to and manage already. And what they're bringing on the network to do is take, often 30 to 50%, sometimes even more, of the revenue from the advertisers in exchange for just handling it all. And so that's the other side of things. And so, of course, in order to, monetize your show, the network is only going to pay you based on the impressions that you get. And so as a small podcaster, if you sign up to a network, you may get some ad revenue, but it's not going to be more than you could have got on your own based on your impressions. It will actually be less, because now you're giving away probably 50% of your revenue to the network, but the upside is that you don't have to go out and get it. So if you already were getting sponsorships and you don't grow your show at all, you are now going to be making less by being on a network. If you did not have any sponsorships, but you did have a decent audience size, now the network can handle that for you, and you actually might get some revenue from that, because you were getting zero, but you had an audience that is valuable to sponsors. Now you plug into the network, they're taking 50% of that, and you're getting that 50% that you never were getting anyway. And so a lot of times there will be agreements where if you bring sponsors or advertisers onto your show, you get to keep a greater percentage of that, or if the network brings them on, they get to keep a greater percentage. And so there's some details there. Now, a couple other things to consider when thinking about joining a network. In my experience, there are I would say almost most networks that are out there, and we're not talking the big, well-known networks, but there are countless small networks, niche networks that are out there. The vast majority of them that I have seen were started by individual podcast hosts who thought, hey, if I started a network, I could get more promotion for my show as well as expand, the inventory that I have for ad sales. And I think that this generally comes from a good-hearted place, but oftentimes they did not really think about this from a strategic perspective of like, okay, now I'm going to be a business owner running this network and have all these shows to manage. And so a lot of times they're just not that well run. And they also tend to the benefits seem to accrue at the founder of the network who, was the original show. And there are, again, this is not a usually greedy type thing that's going on. It's that they know how to run their show. They know how they have an intimate knowledge of their show and everything around it. They might have existing sponsor relationships. And so it just makes sense that theirs is the easiest to make it work. Kind of like with the big shows on a bigger network that okay, this thing is driving this whole thing. I got to really, focus on this because I know this works and I don't really have the time or bandwidth to, chase other shows to get them to insert their cross promotions and whatever. So that is one thing that I am highly skeptical of most networks because they're generally not that well run. It's a tough business to be in. And the profit margins are really narrow a lot of times. And so it is, you need to have a really well-run, well-managed network before I would even consider joining it. And that would be uncovered through, conversations with the founders of the network. I would also look at, what is in the contract in terms of what are your obligations? How many ad spots do you need to have? How many do you have for to be able to, run your own ads for anything of your own stuff on it versus how many do they take up? If you bring in sponsorships or advertisers, how does that look like versus if they bring them in? All kinds of stuff like that. What are the terms? If you want to leave, what does that look like? So there's a lot there. And also, what are they promising in terms of cross promotions? Are they promising to get you on a certain number of impressions on their other shows per month? What does that look like? And I would want to get that all in writing so that you have a kind of clear sense of that. Now, speaking of that, I mentioned one of the other things around inventory. How much do you keep for your own stuff? And so if you run a business, you may want to promote your lead magnet, your product or service. A lot of times, being on a network might take up all your ad slots, so you can no longer do that. And so that may be a heavy price to pay, too heavy a price to pay, potentially, depending if your business model runs on that and requires you to be able to promote your own stuff. I will kind of just round this up by saying again that networks, in my experience, are rarely the cure-all that most people think they are. And usually I think most shows are actually better staying solo on their own. And so something to consider. I have not heard very many success stories. I've heard way more. I haven't heard horror stories. I've just heard disappointment stories where people get on a network and they think now I'm going to really start growing, and it doesn't work out that way. And so I think if you can get your way onto a marquee network, and so you thinking like HubSpot or LinkedIn or Wondery or one of these big networks, I think there's more opportunity there. But that's the most competitive networks in the world. They're taking the best of the best shows in the world, and so you got to have a show that has that kind of potential. The other thing to think about is when thinking about networks, what are you bringing to the table for them? And so essentially you have an existing audience, which implies existing revenue that they can capitalize on, or your show has potential that is untapped. And so you have a really, really strong, sexy, hooky premise that you've already put in a lot of the work to validate and show that, hey, there is potential here. And if we had more budget, more time, more resources behind it, more cross promotion, we're going to be able to really bring in a big audience, and it needs to be aligned with the network's strategy, as well as maybe any gaps in their content. So maybe they're looking for a show that complements the other shows on the network already, and so and if you can make a strong pitch there and you have a really strong premise, that is a potentially good opportunity. The one other thing that I'll mention in terms of network compatibility here is thinking about like what you want, and this is maybe another downside of a lot of like indie networks that just aren't well run, is they have no editorial cohesion, almost, I would say, where they'll just take shows on any and every topic. And this is a clear sign that the only thing that the person running the network cares about is ad inventory. And it's probably not going to be a good fit for cross promotion and growth. It may be still a good fit for ad sales. And there are actually a lot of shows will be on two networks where one will handle ad sales and one will handle cross promotion and growth and marketing. And so that's something, to consider as well. Some networks also handle production to some extent. And so that's another kind of thing to think about. And so if your goal is growth with the network, you want to be looking for a network that has complementary shows to yours. And so people who listen to, these other shows that are already on the network are at least a good portion of those are in your ideal listener kind of avatar. So that would be something else to consider. And I actually remembered the last thing that I was trying to think of in terms of something else to think about and consider before joining a network is that most networks will require you to shift podcast hosts onto their platform. And so you will turn over your host, your show will be transferred to their platform. And usually it's at a network level where they can just insert ads automatically across all the shows. So they don't have to chase, 30 different shows and get them to like say, hey, did you upload your ad? And we need the advertisers looking for the reports and they're wondering if this ran and all this kind of stuff, which would just be a nightmare. So usually you will be required to switch hosts to something that they're under, often like Megaphone or something like that, Acast maybe, or there's a bunch of other bigger, more enterprise network optimized podcast hosting platforms. So those are some of the pros and cons, some of the ways to think about, whether or not a network might be a good fit. I generally shy away from them. I don't know that I would ever join a network myself. It just doesn't seem like, especially if you own a business, I just do not really see much of a scenario where it's really worth it unless you're already so big that really they're handling a lot of the grunt work in terms of ad sales and kind of behind the scenes cross promotion stuff. But it's like, it only becomes worth it when you don't actually need it is my experience. And so other people, there's a few people who probably have had different experiences, but I would say that those are typically the outliers from what I've seen. So I hope that is helpful. And let me know if you have any more questions on networks, and I would love to riff on them further.